In the summer of 480 before the Common Era, 300 Spartan warriors stood at Thermopylae, not because they had been drilled into mindless automatons, but because every moment of their lives from age 7 onward had been carefully calibrated to produce men who would rather die than break formation. What actually happened in that training, day by day and year by year, bears little resemblance to the myths we have inherited. This is the story of the agoge, the Spartan training system, that turned boys into hoplites and shaped one of the most feared infantry forces the ancient world ever produced. It begins in the valleys of Laconia, where the Eurotas River wound through farmland worked by people who were not free. It moves through the barracks where children slept on reeds and learned to endure cold, hunger, and pain as deliberate pedagogy. It examines the dining messes, where grown men ate together every night for decades, the phalanx formations where survival depended entirely on the discipline of the man beside them, and the economic foundations built on subjugation that made the entire system possible. The historical reality was stranger, more brutal, and more fragile than the legend suggests. The evidence for Spartan training comes primarily from writers who never experienced it firsthand. Plutarch, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, compiled traditions and anecdotes centuries after Sparta's military dominance had collapsed. Xenophon, an Athenian who admired Sparta and lived among Spartans in the 4th century before the Common Era, offered a more contemporary account, but one coloured by his own philosophical commitments. Both men wrote in Greek societies that had already begun to mythologize Sparta as an archaic wonder, a place where men were harder and simpler than the cosmopolitan, commerce-obsessed citizens of Athens or Corinth. Archaeology adds fragments, weapons, armor, grave goods, the ruins of sanctuaries. Inscriptions preserve lists of names, dedications to gods, and occasional laws. The picture that emerges is incomplete, but coherent enough to distinguish reality from fantasy. Sparta was located in the southeastern Peloponnese, centered on the fertile valley of the Eurotas River in the region called Laconia. The land was not poor, but neither was it naturally defensible. No great walls surrounded the city in its classical period. Spartans did not need walls, they said, because they had men. That confidence rested on a foundation of systematic coercion. By the 7th century before the Common Era, Sparta had conquered neighboring Messenia and reduced its population to helotry, a form of state-owned serfdom. Helots worked the land, delivered a portion of the harvest to Spartan citizens, and lived under the perpetual threat of violence. They outnumbered their masters roughly 7-1. That imbalance shaped everything. Spartan society became a garrison state not out of abstract militarism, but out of practical necessity. To control a hostile, subjugated majority, Spartans needed to remain perpetually ready for war, perpetually cohesive, and perpetually willing to suppress rebellion without hesitation. The agoge was the instrument that produced such men. It began at age 7, when boys were taken from their families and organized into herds supervised by older youths. They slept on reed mats they had gathered themselves, wore a single cloak year-round, and received just enough food to stay functional. Hunger was policy. Boys were encouraged to steal food to supplement their rations, and if they were caught, they were beaten not for the theft, but for the failure of cunning. The lesson was clear-headed. Survival required resourcefulness, and shame came not from breaking rules but from incompetence. Literacy was taught sparingly, just enough to read orders and sing the poems that reinforced communal values. Music mattered more than grammar. Spartan boys learned marching songs, hymns to Apollo and Artemis, and the verses of Tyrtaeus, the poet who had written about standing firm in battle and dying well. Physical training intensified as boys aged. They wrestled, ran, and threw javelins. They learned to move in formation, to keep pace with others, to respond to commands without hesitation. Pain was ritualized. At the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, boys underwent public whippings, and endurance under the lash became a measure of worth. Plutarch claimed that some boys died during these ordeals rather than cry out, though whether this reflects historical practice or later embellishment remains uncertain. What is clear is that Spartan training valorized endurance and constructed toughness as both physical and moral. The boy who flinched, who complained, who sought comfort, marked himself as weak. Weakness was unbearable in a society that depended on collective strength. At around age 20, those who survived the agoge became eligible for military service and membership in a sicyon, one of the communal dining messes that structured adult male life. These messes were not optional. A Spartan man who could not gain admission to a sicyon, or who failed to contribute his monthly rations of barley, wine, cheese and figs from his assigned land allotment, lost his status as a full citizen. The meals themselves were famously austere. The staple was a black broth made from pork, blood, vinegar and salt, which other Greeks found revolting. One story, probably apocryphal but illustrative, tells of a foreign king who tasted the broth and declared it inedible, until a Spartan explained that it only tasted good after a day of training in the Eurytas. Whether or not the broth was truly that bad, the principle was real. Spartan life was designed to strip away luxury and dependence on comfort, to make men capable of functioning under deprivation. The ultimate purpose of all this training was the phalanx. Spartan hoplites fought in tight formation, 8 rows deep, each man carrying a large round shield, called an aspis, that protected not only himself, but the soldier to his left. The front rank held 8-foot spears levelled at the enemy. Rear ranks pressed forward, adding weight and replacing casualties. Cohesion was everything. If one man broke and ran, he exposed the flank of the man beside him and unravelled the line. Spartan training built men who would not break. They advanced to the sound of flutes, maintaining rhythm and formation even under missile fire. They did not chase fleeing enemies or break ranks for plunder. Discipline, not ferocity, made them formidable. But the system carried contradictions. It could never resolve. Sparta called its male citizens homou, the equals, and insisted that all Spartiates shared the same austere lifestyle. In practice, wealth and landholdings varied considerably, and influence followed wealth. The agoge trained boys to obey, to endure, and to suppress individuality, but it did not prepare them to adapt. Spartan tactics were effective in pitched infantry battles on flat ground, but they struggled in sieges, naval warfare, and irregular combat. The reliance on helot labor freed Spartiates to train full-time, but it also made the system rigid. As the population of full citizens declined over the centuries due to war casualties, inheritance patterns that concentrated land in fewer hands, and the stringent requirements of Syssitia membership, Sparta found itself with too few men to field armies or suppress revolts. The earthquake of 464 before the Common Era triggered a massive helot uprising that nearly destroyed Sparta. Decades later, the Battle of Leuctra in 371 before the Common Era shattered Spartan military supremacy, when the Theban general Epaminondas deployed deeper formations and oblique tactics that overwhelmed the Spartan right wing. Messenia was liberated, and with it went the economic base that had sustained the agoge. By the Hellenistic period, Sparta survived as a curiosity, a place where tourists came to watch staged rituals of endurance and imagine the warriors of the past. What follows is an account of that system in its full complexity, the geography and economy that made it necessary, the childhood stolen by the state, the barracks and messes that replaced family, the phalanx that gave it meaning, and the internal contradictions that ensured it could not last. The story begins not with warriors but with the land they controlled and the people they subjugated, because without understanding the helots, one cannot understand why Sparta became what it was. Laconia occupies the southeastern corner of the Peloponnese, a region defined by mountains, narrow valleys and the slow ribbon of the Eurotas River. The river descends from the Taygetus Range in the west and the Parnan Mountains in the east, carving a fertile corridor through otherwise rugged terrain. The valley floor provided enough arable land to support grain, olive groves and modest vineyards, but Laconia was never abundant. The soil was workable but not rich. The climate was Mediterranean, hot and dry in summer, mild and wet in winter, suitable for subsistence agriculture, but not for surplus wealth. The mountains hemmed the valley in, creating a landscape more isolated than the plains of Argos or the harbours of Attica. Sparta itself sat roughly in the centre of this corridor, a loose collection of villages rather than a walled city, vulnerable to invasion, but difficult to approach without crossing high passes or navigating narrow defiles. Geography shaped options. Laconia had no natural harbour of significance, no mineral wealth worth exploiting, and no easy route to the sea. The Spartans who settled here in the Dorian migrations after the collapse of the Bronze Age palatial system found themselves surrounded by neighbours but insulated by terrain. They could control the valley if they held it by force, but they could not easily expand beyond it without war. For the first few centuries, Spartan society resembled other Greek polis, a warrior aristocracy, small farms, local disputes, and occasional skirmishes. Then came the decision that defined everything afterward. Rather than trading or colonizing, Sparta turned west and conquered Messenia. The First Messenian War began sometime in the mid-8th century before the Common Era, though exact dates remain disputed. Messenia lay across the Tigris Mountains, a broader and more fertile valley than Laconia, watered by the Pamissos River. It was better farmland, capable of producing more grain and supporting more people. Sparta invaded, and the war lasted decades. When it ended, Messenia belonged to Sparta, but the Messenians themselves were not killed or expelled. They were reduced to helots, a subjected population bound to the land and forced to labour for Spartan masters. This was not chattel slavery. Helots could not be sold individually or separated from their families arbitrarily, and they retained some communal identity and local customs. But they worked land they did not own, delivered half their produce to Spartan overlords, and lived under the constant threat of violence. The Second Messenian War erupted in the 7th century before the Common Era, when the Helots revolted. The uprising nearly succeeded. Sparta survived, but the lesson was clear. The Helots outnumbered Spartan citizens by a wide margin, perhaps 7-1 or more, and they hated their subjugation. Any lapse in control, any moment of weakness, invited rebellion. The solution Sparta adopted was not reconciliation or reform. It was perpetual militarization. Every Spartan male citizen would train for war from childhood onward. Every aspect of social life would reinforce cohesion, obedience, and readiness. The Helots would be kept in terror, and Spartans would never allow themselves to become soft or distracted. This arrangement required infrastructure. Spartan citizens, now called Spartiates or homoio, the equals, were assigned plots of land called klero. Each kleros was worked by helot families who lived on the land and delivered a fixed portion of the harvest to the Spartiate, who held the allotment. The system freed Spartiates from agricultural labour entirely. They did not plant, plough, or harvest. They trained, fought, and attended to the rituals and duties of citizenship. The helots did everything else. They grew barley and wheat, tended olive trees, raised sheep and goats, pressed oil, made wine, repaired tools, wove cloth, and hauled goods. They fed Sparta. The Helots were not a faceless mass. They had families, dialects, shrines, and memories of autonomy. Many were Messenian, but others were Laconian, descendants of populations subjugated earlier or absorbed over time. They lived in villages scattered across the countryside, clustering near their assigned plots, travelling to deliver goods to Spartan households or communal messes. They were forbidden to carry weapons except when pressed into military service as light infantry or baggage carriers during campaigns. They wore rough tunics and worked with their hands. They were visible everywhere, essential to every function of daily life, and resented for it. Spartans did not trust them. The fear was structural, baked into every institution. Helots were too many, too organized, and too familiar with the land. They knew where Spartans slept, where food was stored, which roads led to the mountains. If they coordinated, if they timed an uprising well, they could overwhelm the citizen body through sheer numbers. Sparta responded with calculated terror. Each year the ephors, the 5 elected magistrates who held executive power, formally declared war on the Helots. This was not metaphor, it was legal procedure. Declaring war meant that killing a Helot was not murder. It meant that young Spartans selected for the Crypteia, a secretive rite of passage, could hunt Helots in the countryside without legal consequence. It meant that violence against helots was not crime but policy. The cryptia operated in shadows. Selected youths, usually in their late teens, were sent into the countryside with minimal supplies, a knife and instructions to survive alone, while terrorizing the helot population. They moved at night, targeted helots who seemed strong or defiant, and killed them quietly. The practice served multiple purposes. It culled potential leaders among the helots, reminded the subjugated population of their vulnerability, and hardened young Spartans by forcing them to kill in cold blood without the sanction of open battle. Ancient sources mention it with discomfort, and later writers debated whether it was a permanent institution or an emergency measure. The ambiguity suggests that even among Greeks who admired Spartan discipline, the cryptia crossed boundaries. Daily life for helots meant labor under surveillance. They rose before dawn, worked the fields, delivered goods to Spartan households, and returned to their villages under watchful eyes. They were required to wear dogskin caps, a mark of their status, humiliating and visible. They were forced to drink unmixed wine until drunk during certain festivals, paraded before Spartan boys as examples of what self-indulgence produced. They were beaten publicly and arbitrarily to remind them of their place. Some helots served as domestic attendants in Spartan homes. Others accompanied Spartans to war, carrying shields and supplies, sometimes fighting as skirmishers. A small number earned their freedom through military service, becoming a class called neo-damodius, new citizens, but they were never full Spartiates and remained subordinate. The kaleros system itself was fragile. A Spartiate, who could not contribute his required portion of barley, wine, and other goods to his syssitia, his communal mess, lost his citizenship. If his helots failed to produce enough, or if his land was poor, or if he lost access to his kaleros through debt or inheritance disputes, he fell out of the equals and became a hippomion, an inferior. This meant that Spartiate status depended entirely on helot labor, functioning smoothly and reliably. It also meant that population decline among Spartiates was catastrophic. Fewer citizens meant fewer kaleroi worked, fewer contributions to messes, fewer hoplites to field. The system had no flexibility. It demanded constant numbers, constant output, and constant control. Messenia provided the majority of helot labor and the surplus that allowed Sparta to maintain a professional citizen army. Losing Messenia, as Sparta eventually did after the Battle of Leuctra in 371 before the Common Era, destroyed the economic base. Without Messenian grain and helot labor, the kleros system collapsed. The agoge, the training regimen that required Spartiates to live in barracks and devote themselves to war, became unsustainable. Sparta endured as a city, but it ceased to function as the military society it had built itself to be. The helots were not silent or passive. They revolted when earthquakes weakened Sparta. They fled when foreign armies invaded Laconia. They remembered. Some ancient writers described them as resentful but cowed, others as constantly plotting. The truth was likely both. Most helots worked, survived, and avoided attention. A few resisted. The majority waited. They knew Sparta depended on them, and they knew that dependence was Sparta's greatest vulnerability. Spartans knew it too. To maintain control over a population that outnumbered them 7-1, Spartans built a society organized entirely around military cohesion and perpetual vigilance. That society began its work on boys before they could read. A Spartan child entered the world under scrutiny. Birth did not guarantee a place in the city. Within days of delivery, the infant was carried to a place called the Lesh, a colonnade near the center of Sparta where the eldest men of the tribe gathered. These elders examined the child for signs of weakness or deformity, limbs that twisted wrongly, a chest that seemed too narrow, a general frailty that suggested the body would not endure. If the child appeared robust and well-formed, the elders nodded. The family kept the baby. If not, the child was taken to a chasm in the Taygetus Mountains called the Apothetai and left to exposure. Plutarch describes this practice matter-of-factly, and while modern archaeologists have found fewer infant remains at the site than the sources suggest, the cultural logic remains clear. Sparta could not afford citizens who could not fight. The inspection was not cruelty for its own sake. It was state policy rooted in survival. The practice of exposure was not unique to Sparta. Many Greek cities allowed families to abandon unwanted children, usually for economic reasons. What set Sparta apart was that the decision belonged to the state rather than the father, and the criteria were explicitly physical. Strength mattered more than legitimacy or family standing. A wealthy man's sickly son had no more claim to life than a poor man's. The elders acted as gatekeepers, and their judgment once rendered was final. This was the first lesson a Spartan learned. Even if he could not remember it, the state owned him before his parents did. Those who passed inspection returned home to their mothers. For the first 7 years, Spartan boys lived much like other Greek children, within the household under the care of women. But the atmosphere differed. Spartan mothers and nurses were encouraged to raise children without coddling. Infants were bathed in cold water rather than warm. Babies were not swaddled tightly in cloth. A common Greek practice meant to keep limbs straight, but left relatively free to move and strengthen their muscles. If a child cried at night, no one rushed to comfort him. Spartan nurses developed a reputation across Greece for their no-nonsense methods, and wealthy families in Athens and elsewhere sometimes hired them, hoping to instill a bit of Laconian toughness in their own sons. Food in early childhood was plain and deliberately insufficient to satisfy. The goal was not starvation, but the cultivation of hunger as a familiar condition. A child who grew up, never quite full, would not falter later when rations were scarce. Clothing was minimal. Even in winter, boys wore a single thin cloak and went barefoot. Cold, hunger, and discomfort were not hardships to be avoided, but tools for shaping resilience. The body learned early that it would not always be warm or fed, and the mind learned not to complain. Girls received similar treatment. Sparta was unusual among Greek cities in training its daughters physically, while Athenian girls remained indoors learning weaving and household management. Spartan girls ran, wrestled, and threw the javelin. The reasoning was both practical and ideological. Strong mothers produced strong sons, and Spartan women needed the stamina to manage estates while their husbands lived in barracks. Plutarch reports that girls exercised naked alongside boys in public festivals, a practice that scandalized other Greeks but which Spartans defended as promoting health and pride in physical fitness. This emphasis on female strength set Sparta apart. Though it did not grant women political equality, their role remained fundamentally reproductive to bear children healthy enough to pass the elders' inspection. The years before 7 were also the only time Spartan boys lived with their families in any sustained way. Fathers, if they were home at all, spent most of their time in the syssitia, the communal messes that bound Spartan men together. Mothers managed the household, the slaves, and the land allotment that fed the family. Helots worked the fields and delivered the barley, oil, and wine that sustained the household. Though the relationship between Spartan mother and helot servant was fraught with unspoken tension, every helot was a reminder that the system depended on subjugation, and every Spartan child grew up watching that dynamic unfold. The cultural messages absorbed during these early years were consistent. Obedience to elders was absolute, physical toughness was virtue, complaint was weakness. Spartan children learned a dialect distinct from other Greeks, clipped and economical, with few words wasted on elaboration. Laconism, the term derived from Laconia, meant exactly this: speech, stripped to its essential function. Stories and songs reinforced the values. Mothers sang of warriors who had died gloriously. Nurses recounted legends of Lycurgus, the lawgiver who had supposedly shaped Spartan institutions centuries before, and of Spartan victories won through discipline and contempt for fear. Even in play, the themes were martial. Boys wrestled, chased one another, and competed in tests of endurance. At some point near the age of 7, the transition began. The exact moment varied, but the outcome was the same. A boy was removed from his mother's care and taken to live with other boys under the supervision of older youths and state-appointed overseers. There was no ceremony marking the occasion, no ritual to soften the separation. One day the child lived at home, the next he did not. His head was shaved. He was given a single cloak and a reed mat to sleep on. He joined an agela, a herd, and from that moment forward his life belonged to Sparta. His mother would see him occasionally, but she no longer fed him, clothed him, or comforted him. Those tasks, if they could be called that, now fell to the paid onomos, the boy herder, and to the older boys who enforced discipline with fists and sticks. The emotional weight of this transition is difficult to measure. Ancient sources do not dwell on the feelings of 7-year-old children, and Spartan culture prized stoicism over sentiment, but it is worth pausing to consider what was taken. A child who had spent every night of his short life sleeping near his mother, who knew the sounds of his household and the rhythms of his family's routines, was suddenly thrust into a world governed by older boys and deliberate cruelty. He was expected to adapt without tears. If he cried, he was beaten. If he hesitated, he was mocked. The state had claimed him, and the claiming was absolute. Other Greek cities educated boys, but they did so while allowing children to remain at home. Spartan education was different, not merely in its harshness, but in its totality. The agoge was not school. It was the replacement of the family with the collective, the substitution of parental care with state-orchestrated deprivation. The boy learned quickly that survival required vigilance, that comfort was a memory, and that the only reliable bonds were those forged with the boys who suffered alongside him. This was the foundation on which everything else would be built. At 7, the family home disappeared. The boy was now property of the state, and his education would be shaped not by parents but by older boys, hard ground and hunger. At 7, the Spartan boy left his mother's house and entered a world designed to strip away softness. The state became his parent, his peers became his family, the ground became his bed. From this point forward, every hour of his existence served a single purpose: to make him capable of standing in formation beside other men and refusing to break no matter what came at him. The boys were sorted into groups called ageli, which translates roughly as herds. The word was not accidental. Spartans spoke plainly about what they were doing. These were not students enrolled in a school. They were young animals being shaped into something useful. Each agel contained boys of similar age, perhaps 20 or 30 in total, and each herd fell under the supervision of an older youth called a paidonomos. The paidonomos was typically in his late teens or early 20s, a young man who had survived the agoge himself and now served as enforcer, instructor, and model. He carried a whip. He used it. The paidonomos held authority that was absolute within his herd, but was himself accountable to adult overseers called the bidualou, older men who monitored training across the entire system. These men watched constantly, looking for signs of weakness, disobedience, or excessive cruelty. The balance was delicate. The goal was endurance, not destruction. A boy broken too early became useless, but a boy allowed to remain soft endangered everyone who would one day stand beside him in the phalanx. So the bidualou calibrated suffering with care, adjusting pressure as needed, ensuring that each cohort emerged hardened but functional. The boys slept in communal barracks on pallets they made themselves from reeds gathered along the Eurotas River. They were shown how to break the stems by hand, without using a knife, and how to weave them into rough mats that provided minimal cushioning against the cold stone floors. In winter, they were permitted to add this tulle down for insulation, a concession that made the difference between discomfort and frostbite. The barracks were unheated. Spartan winters in the Eurotas Valley were not as brutal as those farther north, but night temperatures regularly dropped near freezing, and the boys wore only a single thin cloak year-round. No tunic beneath, no extra blanket. The cloak served as clothing by day and covering by night, and it was never enough. They bathed infrequently, in cold water, and were forbidden from oiling their skin as other Greeks did. The result was a cohort of boys who looked leaner and rougher than their counterparts in Athens or Corinth. Their hair was kept short. Their feet were often bare, even on rocky ground, to toughen the soles. Spartan boys were recognizable at a glance, not because they wore uniforms, but because deprivation left its marks on the body. Thin frames, calloused hands, a certain vigilance in the eyes. Food was provided, but never enough. This was policy, not accident. The boys received rations sufficient to prevent starvation but insufficient to satisfy hunger. They were expected to supplement their meals by stealing, not occasionally, but constantly. Theft was not punished. Getting caught was the distinction mattered. A boy who successfully stole food demonstrated cunning, boldness, and the ability to move undetected, all qualities useful in war. A boy who bungled the theft and got caught demonstrated incompetence, and incompetence earned a beating. The most famous story involves a boy who stole a fox, hid it under his cloak, and allowed the animal to gnaw into his stomach rather than reveal the theft when questioned. He died from the injury without making a sound. Plutarch records this tale centuries later, and it has the shape of legend, but the principle behind it was real enough. Endurance mattered more than survival. Pain was temporary. Shame was permanent. The boys learned early that their bodies were tools, not treasures, and that the worst thing they could do was show weakness in front of their peers. Music and poetry formed a central part of training, though not in ways that other Greeks would recognize as gentle or refined. The boys learned to sing in unison, marching songs and hymns to Apollo and Artemis, and they learned traditional poetry that praised courage and mocked cowardice. The rhythms were simple, the melodies austere. Spartan music was not about beauty. It was about cohesion. Singing together taught boys to breathe together, move together, and subsume individual voices into a collective sound. The same principle applied in the phalanx, where survival depended on synchronized movement and the suppression of personal panic. They learned to read and write, but only as much as necessary for basic communication. Spartans prided themselves on brevity. The laconic style, named for their region, valued conciseness to the point of bluntness. A message scratched on a wax tablet or carved into wood conveyed information without ornament. Long speeches were regarded with suspicion. Philosophers who visited Sparta and attempted elaborate rhetoric were often met with silence or cutting replies. The boys absorbed this attitude early. Words were tools, like spears. Use only what you need. Discipline was enforced through public punishment, and the most visible site of that enforcement was the altar of Artemis Orthia, located near the center of Sparta. The ritual associated with this altar became infamous throughout the Greek world. Boys were brought before the altar and whipped, sometimes to the point of bleeding, while their peers and elders watched. The stated purpose was to honor the goddess and test endurance, but the ritual also served as theater. It demonstrated to the community that Spartan boys could withstand pain without crying out, and it reminded each boy that his body was subject to forces larger than himself. The whipping was not random violence. It followed rules. The boys stood in rows, and each received a set number of lashes. They were judged not on whether they flinched, which was nearly impossible to avoid, but on whether they screamed or begged for mercy. Silence was victory. Some boys collapsed. A few died, though this was not the goal. The ritual existed at the edge of what the body could survive, and that edge was precisely where Spartan training aimed. By the Roman period, centuries later, the whipping contests at Artemis Orthia had become tourist spectacles, with permanent stone seating installed for audiences. But in the classical era, they were simply part of the calendar, another mechanism in the system that turned children into hoplites. The boys competed constantly. Races, wrestling matches, mock combat with sticks in place of spears. There were no participation awards. Losing meant shame, and shame meant social isolation within the herd. The paidonymos encouraged rivalry, setting boys against one another to sharpen aggression and identify who could lead and who would follow. Friendships formed, but they were shaped by hierarchy. A boy learned quickly who was stronger, faster, and more ruthless, and he adjusted his behavior accordingly. The system did not eliminate individuality, but it made individuality costly. Standing out for the wrong reasons brought punishment. Blending into the herd, moving with it, surviving as part of it, brought safety. At night, after the exercises and the singing and the meager meal, the boys lay on their reed mats in the dark barracks and listened to the sounds of other herds in nearby buildings. Coughing whispers, the occasional cry of a boy startling from a nightmare. The paidonymos slept among them, close enough to hear but separate enough to maintain authority. There was no privacy, no moment unobserved. The architecture of the agoge was designed to eliminate the boundary between self and group, to make solitude impossible and collective identity inevitable. By the time a boy reached 12, he had spent 5 years in this system. His body had changed. He was leaner, harder, more watchful. His relationship to pain had shifted. Hunger was familiar. Cold was familiar. The sting of the whip was familiar. He had learned to steal without getting caught, to endure beatings without weeping, to sing in formation and sleep on stone. He had learned that his survival depended on the others in his herd and that their survival depended on him. He had learned that the individual mattered less than the unit, and that shame was worse than injury. But he was still a child, and the next phase of training would take what had been built in these years and intensify it beyond anything he had yet experienced. As boys entered their teens, the stakes rose. Training intensified, violence became ritualized, and the line between education and cruelty blurred further. At 12, the Spartan boy crossed an invisible threshold. The agoge did not announce this transition with ceremony or celebration. Instead, the drills became harder, the scrutiny sharper, the stakes undeniable. The reed mats and stolen food remained, but now the training assumed the boy had a body that could be pushed further and a mind that understood what was being built. Not endurance alone, but the reflexes and cohesion required of men who would one day stand in the phalanx. The years between 12 and 20 were not simply more of the same. They introduced weapons, formalized mentorship, and opened a door to violence that extended beyond the barracks into the hills of Laconia, where some boys hunted other human beings in the dark. Physical training intensified in ways that mimicked the demands of hoplite warfare. Boys ran longer distances, often in full sunlight across rocky terrain, building the stamina needed to march for hours under the weight of bronze and wood. Wrestling became more systematic, taught not as sport but as preparation for close combat when formation broke and men grappled in the crush. Spartans valued wrestling for its utility. It taught balance, leverage, and how to stay on your feet when shoved. Competitions were frequent and public, and losing brought shame that lingered longer than bruises. The older instructors, themselves veterans, watched for signs of hesitation or weakness. A boy who flinched, who quit, who showed pain too openly, found himself mocked not just by peers but by men whose approval mattered. Shame was a tool as deliberate as any spear, and Spartan pedagogy wielded it without apology. By 15, boys began training with weapons. The spear came first, an 8-foot shaft of ash or cornel wood, tipped with iron, heavy enough to require strength but balanced for thrusting. Learning to hold it correctly, to brace it against the shoulder, to angle it downward toward an opponent's throat or groin, took months. The aspis, the great round shield, came next. It weighed between 7 and 8 kilograms, and carrying it for any length of time strained the forearm and shoulder, but the shield was not merely personal protection. In the phalanx, each man's shield covered the soldier to his left, creating a wall that only worked if every man held position. Dropping your shield endangered your comrade more than yourself, and that understanding was drilled into adolescence through repetition and public rebuke. Boys practiced moving in formation, maintaining alignment, keeping the shield high and steady, even as their arms burned. The alos, a double-reeded pipe, sometimes accompanied these drills, its rhythm teaching boys to march in step and strike in unison. Coordination mattered more than individual prowess. Spartans did not celebrate the warrior who broke ranks to chase glory. They celebrated the line that held. Mentorship formalized through relationships that blended affection, instruction, and social control. An older warrior, usually in his 20s or 30s, selected a younger boy, and the two became linked in a bond called Erastes and Eromenos, lover and beloved. The relationship carried expectations on both sides. The older man, the Erastes, bore responsibility for the boy's training and moral development. He corrected errors, offered advice, modeled courage, and shared the burdens of barracks life. If the boy disgraced himself, the shame fell on the mentor as well, creating a system of mutual accountability. The younger boy, the Eromenos, owed obedience, effort, and loyalty. The relationships were often intimate, and physical affection was neither hidden nor condemned. Sparta understood these bonds as pedagogical, a means of transferring not just skill but ethos from one generation to the next. Other Greeks found Spartan attitudes toward these relationships unusual, though not because they occurred. Similar practices existed elsewhere, but because Spartans embedded them so openly into military training. The Erastes became a second father, a protector, and a judge whose approval the boy sought more urgently than almost any other. Singing and dancing occupied more time than moderns might expect in a society obsessed with war. Spartans sang constantly, marching songs, hymns to gods, paeans before battle, choral odes at festivals. Boys learned traditional verses composed centuries earlier, many attributed to poets like Titius, whose lines celebrated death in defense of the polis and scorned the man who fled. The songs taught values through repetition, embedding expectations so deeply that they became reflex. Dancing served a similar function. Spartan dances were not recreational but martial, emphasizing synchronized movement, rhythm, and spatial awareness. Boys danced in formation, mimicking the movements of the phalanx, learning to move as a unit without verbal commands. The dances trained the body to respond to rhythm, preparing it for the alos music that would guide men into battle. Coordination in song and dance translated directly into coordination under bronze and iron. The Spartans understood that warriors who could move together, who responded to the same beat without thinking, survived longer and killed more effectively. Around 18 or 19, some boys received an invitation that carried no refusal. They were selected for the cryptia, a practice so secretive that later sources disagreed on its details and frequency. The word itself meant hidden or secret, and the practice lived up to its name. Selected youths were sent alone into the countryside, given a knife or short sword, and instructed to survive without being seen. They were to steal food, avoid detection, and at night hunt helots. The killings were deliberate, sanctioned by the state, and aimed at helots who showed signs of strength, intelligence, or potential resistance. The cryptia served multiple purposes. It tested self-sufficiency and stealth, skills useful for scouts and raiders. It hardened boys to killing, removing hesitation before their first battle, and it spread terror among the helot population, reminding them that even in their own fields, in the dark, Spartan eyes were watching. Ancient writers like Plutarch found the practice disturbing, describing it as both training and ritualized murder. Modern scholars debate how widespread the cryptia was, whether it occurred annually or irregularly, and whether all youths participated or only a chosen few. What is certain is that it existed, that it involved killing helots, and that Spartans saw no contradiction between their ideals of honor and sending teenagers into the hills to hunt human beings who could not fight back. The logic of the cryptia reveals the moral architecture of Sparta more clearly than any hymn or statue. Helots were not fellow citizens. They were property, threats, a permanent enemy contained only by force and fear. Training boys to kill helots reinforced the boundary between Spartiate and subjugated, between those who belonged to the state and those who served it. The cryptia also offered a dark apprenticeship in violence, one conducted away from the barracks and the eyes of mentors, where a boy faced hunger, solitude, and the choice to kill or fail. Those who returned had crossed a line. They had taken life deliberately, coldly, without the excuse of battle or the cover of formation. They had learned that survival sometimes required cruelty, and that the state would not only permit but reward it. The cryptia was efficient pedagogy for a society that needed men capable of absolute loyalty and absolute ruthlessness. It was also evidence of the fear that shadowed every Spartan institution, the knowledge that the laborers who fed them outnumbered them 7-1 and would rise if given the chance. Public competitions continued throughout adolescence, and the stakes were no longer merely physical. Boys competed in singing, dancing, debating, and endurance contests that tested not just strength but composure under scrutiny. The city held festivals where youths performed before elders, their movements and voices judged for precision and unity. Falling out of step, forgetting lyrics, showing fatigue too openly, all brought public criticism. Spartans believed that shame shaped behavior more reliably than praise, and they structured training to maximize both. A boy who excelled earned brief acknowledgement and the envy of peers. A boy who failed carried the weight of collective disappointment. The system produced cohesion, but it also produced casualties. Boys who could not meet expectations, who broke under pressure, who lost their place in the mess and their claim to citizenship. Later sources mention men called trescentes, cowards who had failed in battle or training, and who lived the rest of their lives as social ghosts. The possibility of becoming trescentes haunted every adolescent, a fate worse than death because it meant exile within your own city. By 18, boys had spent more than a decade in the agoge. They had learned to endure cold, hunger, and pain. They had trained with weapons, marched in formation, sung the old songs, and obeyed men who offered little warmth and less mercy. Some had gone into the countryside and returned with blood on their hands. They had been shaped piece by piece into instruments of the state, and the state was not finished with them. The agoge had taught them to survive, to obey, and to hate comfort, but it had not yet made them hoplites. That required another decade, not in the hills or the barracks alone, but in the mess halls where men ate together, fought together, and died knowing that their name would be remembered only if they did not run. By 20, a young man had survived the agoge, but he was not yet a full citizen. That required another decade in the barracks learning to live and fight as one indivisible unit. At 20, a Spartan man who had survived the agoge faced a test more social than physical. He had to be accepted into a syssitia, one of the communal dining messes that formed the backbone of Spartan citizenship. Without membership, he could not become a full Spartiate. The vote was conducted by existing members who dropped balls of bread into a vessel. A single flattened ball, crushed between fingers to signal rejection, was enough to deny entry. The system was designed to ensure cohesion, but it also meant that a young man's future hinged on the judgment of 15 or so peers who had watched him grow up, knew his weaknesses, and would spend the next decades eating beside him every night. Once admitted, the obligations were immediate and unyielding. Each member contributed a monthly ration drawn from his klaros, the plot of land worked by helots and assigned to him by the state. The standard contribution included roughly 1 medimnos of barley, about 50 litres, 8 chos of wine, 5 minas of cheese, 2.5 minas of figs, and a small sum of money for additional provisions like meat or fish. Failure to provide these goods, whether through crop failure, helot rebellion, or simple poverty, meant expulsion from the mess and loss of citizenship. The system was meant to enforce equality, but it also revealed a harsh arithmetic. Not all klaros were equally productive. Some men struggled, and those who fell behind disappeared from public life, their names erased from the rolls of the homosi. The meals themselves were austere. Spartans ate together each evening in a communal hall, seated on simple wooden benches, their portions served without ceremony. The centerpiece was the infamous black broth, a soup made from pork, blood, vinegar, and salt. Ancient writers treated it as a punchline. Plutarch recounts a story, likely apocryphal but telling, in which a king of Pontus tasted the broth and declared it revolting, only to be told by a Spartan that it tasted best after a day of hard exercise and a cold swim in the ureters. The broth was filling, high in iron, and made from cheap ingredients. It was also, by all accounts, deeply unpleasant. Barley porridge accompanied it, along with wine mixed with water in the Greek fashion, and occasionally small portions of meat from religious sacrifices or hunting. Spartans were not starving, but they were not feasting either. The food was fuel, nothing more, and the lack of variety was deliberate. Dining was ritualized and closely observed. Conversations were expected to be serious, focused on matters of war, politics, or ethics. Laughter was permitted, but gossip and boasting were discouraged. Younger men listened more than they spoke, and elders corrected them sharply when they erred. The mess functioned as a daily seminar in Spartan values, a place where behavior was constantly judged and adjusted. Boys from the agoge were sometimes brought in to observe, standing silently while the men ate, learning the rhythms of adult citizenship. The atmosphere was not warm, it was watchful. The syssitia also served a security function. 15 men who ate together every night, who knew each other's habits and moods, formed a unit of mutual surveillance. A man who expressed doubts about the state, who complained too bitterly about helot labor, or who failed to uphold his duties would find himself quietly reported. There was no privacy in Sparta, and the mess was where that absence was most keenly felt. Loyalty was tested not in moments of crisis, but across thousands of ordinary meals, where silence or hesitation could mark a man as unreliable. The system bound citizens together, but it also ensured conformity. Deviation was visible and punished swiftly. The ideal of equality, so central to Spartan identity, frayed under scrutiny. All Spartiates dined in the messes, and all contributed the same rations, but wealth mattered nonetheless. Some men owned more land than their single kleros, accumulated through inheritance or marriage. Others commanded greater influence through family lineage or military reputation. Spartan society had no formal aristocracy after the reforms attributed to Lycurgus, but informal hierarchies persisted. A man whose father had fought at Plania, whose brothers held important commands, who spoke with authority and moved through the city with confidence, wielded power that no amount of black broth could neutralize. The Syssitia enforced surface uniformity, but beneath it, advantage and disadvantage reproduced themselves quietly. Marriage complicated the structure further. Spartan men typically married around age 30, after a decade in the Syssitia. The wedding itself was brief and strange by Greek standards. The bride, her head shaved and dressed in male clothing, waited in a dark room. The groom visited briefly, consummated the marriage and returned to his barracks. For years afterward, the couple lived apart. Men continued to sleep in communal quarters and eat in the mess. Wives remained in their family homes or in small houses on their husband's land, managing estates, overseeing helot labor, and raising children, largely without male presence. Visits were brief and often clandestine, conducted with a furtiveness that other Greeks found bizarre. The system prioritized male bonding over family cohesion, treating marriage as a mechanism for reproduction rather than a partnership. Spartan law demanded children, but it gave men little time to know them. The result was a society in which men formed their deepest bonds not with wives or children, but with messmates and fellow soldiers. The Syssitia became a substitute family, the barracks a permanent home. Affection, loyalty, and intimacy were directed inward, toward the group of men who shared the same meals and the same risks. This was not accidental. Sparta needed soldiers who would die for each other, and emotional architecture mattered as much as physical training. A man who loved his messmates more than his household, who feared their judgment more than death, would hold the line when others broke. The system worked because it demanded everything and gave men no alternative identity to retreat into. Yet the Syssitia also exposed Sparta's central fragility. Membership required land, and land required helots to work it. As the population of full citizens declined, fewer men could meet the contributions. Some fell into poverty and lost their status. Others consolidated holdings, becoming wealthier while their peers struggled. The principle of equality eroded slowly, meal by meal, as the gap between the richest and poorest Spartiates widened. By the 4th century before the Common Era, the system was visibly strained. Fewer men qualified for the messes, fewer hoplites could be fielded, and the famed cohesion began to crack. The Syssitia had been designed to prevent inequality, but it could not survive the demographic and economic forces that undercut its foundation. For those who remained, the routine endured. Each evening men gathered to eat the same plain food, to speak carefully, to watch and be watched. The Syssitia was not grand or glamorous. It was repetitive, austere, and built on the labor of people who had no choice. But it worked for a time to bind Spartans into a collective identity so strong that individuals dissolved into it. The barracks and the mess hall were not merely training grounds. They were the core of Spartan life, the place where the state's claim on its citizens was renewed every night, one bowl of black broth at a time. All this preparation, all this deprivation and discipline aimed toward one outcome, the phalanx, where men stood shoulder to shoulder and fought as a single organism. All this preparation, all this deprivation and discipline aimed toward one outcome, the phalanx, where men stood shoulder to shoulder and fought as a single organism. The Spartan hoplite was not exceptional because of superhuman strength or individual genius. He was exceptional because 30 years of training had taught him to suppress every instinct that made other men break and run. When the trumpet sounded and the enemy appeared across the plain, the Spartan did not think about glory or survival. He thought about the man on his left, whose life depended on the bronze shield strapped to his own arm, and the man on his right, whose shield wall was the only thing between a spear point and his ribs. The armor itself was heavy, expensive, and designed for a very specific kind of violence. A Spartan hoplite went to war wearing roughly 70 pounds of bronze, linen, and leather. The helmet, forged from a single sheet of hammered bronze, covered the entire head, except for a T-shaped opening for the eyes and mouth. Vision was poor. Hearing was worse. Inside the helmet, the world narrowed to a slot of light, the rasp of breath, and the muffled roar of thousands of men shouting. The Corinthian style, most common in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, offered excellent protection and made peripheral awareness nearly impossible. A hoplite could see what was directly in front of him. Everything else was shape and shadow. The breastplate, either a bronze cuirass molded to the torso, or a composite linothorax made of layered linen, glued and stitched into rigid plates, protected the chest and back. Wealthier hoplites wore bronze. Poorer citizens, or those in later periods when bronze became scarcer, relied on linen reinforced with metal scales. Both were hot, both restricted movement. Greaves, shin guards hammered to fit the contours of each leg, were strapped or clipped into place and added another layer of weight below the knee. A hoplite did not run fast. He did not need to. The shield, called an aspis or hoplon, was the heart of the system. 3 feet in diameter, slightly convex, made of wood covered in a thin layer of bronze, it weighed between 15 and 20 pounds, and was gripped by a bronze armband at the center and a leather strap at the rim. The left arm slid through the armband up to the elbow. The hand gripped the strap near the edge. This design distributed the weight across the forearm and allowed a hoplite to hold the shield steady for hours, but it also meant the shield naturally covered the left side of the body. The right side, the sword arm, remained exposed. In a phalanx, that vulnerability disappeared. Each man's shield protected the soldier standing to his left. If the line held, no one was exposed. If the line broke, everyone died. The primary weapon was the dory, a spear roughly 8 feet long with a leaf-shaped iron point at one end and a bronze spike at the other. The rear spike, called a soriter or lizard killer, served 2 purposes. It counterbalanced the spear, making it easier to wield, and it allowed a hoplite to plant the weapon in the ground, or use it as a backup if the iron point broke. The spear was not thrown, except in desperation. It was thrust overhand or underhand, aimed at the throat, groin, or any gap in an enemy's armor. If the spear shattered, the hoplite drew his xiphos, a short, leaf-bladed iron sword no longer than 2 feet, designed for stabbing in the crush of close combat. There was no room to swing. There was barely room to breathe. The phalanx itself was a formation of staggering simplicity and brutal effectiveness. Hoplites stood in rows, typically 8 deep, though Spartans occasionally fought in fewer or more ranks depending on terrain and enemy. Each man occupied roughly 3 feet of frontage, close enough that shields overlapped. The front rank held their spears leveled toward the enemy. The ranks behind pressed forward, adding weight and replacing anyone who fell. The formation moved as a block, slow and deliberate, closing the distance at a walk. Speed was suicide. If the line became ragged, gaps opened. If gaps opened, the enemy pushed through, and the phalanx collapsed into a slaughter. Spartans advanced to the sound of music. Most Greek armies charged with a roar, a wild sprint meant to break enemy nerve before contact. Spartans marched to the adlos, a double-reeded woodwind that produced a piercing rhythmic drone. Hoplites, musicians trained specifically for this task, stood behind the formation or moved alongside it, playing a steady cadence. The music served 2 purposes. It regulated pace, ensuring the phalanx stayed cohesive, and it calmed men whose hearts were hammering inside their chests. Plutarch, writing 6 centuries after Sparta's peak, claimed that Spartans sang the hymn to Castor as they closed with the enemy, their voices blending with the adlos and the tramp of thousands of sandaled feet on dry ground. Whether this happened at Thermopylae or Plataea is uncertain. What is certain is that other Greeks found Spartan battlefield composure unnerving. Discipline made the difference. While other city-states fielded hoplites who trained occasionally and fought as individuals with shared equipment, Spartans drilled endlessly in formation. They practiced the turn, the countermarch, the controlled advance, the pivot to meet an attack from the flank. They learned to hold the line when the man beside them took a spear to the face and fell. They learned to step over bodies, their own and others, without breaking stride. Xenophon, who fought alongside Spartans and admired them despite his Athenian roots, noted that Spartan commanders gave fewer orders in battle than other generals because Spartan soldiers already knew what to do. There was no need to shout instructions when 30 years of training had made obedience automatic. The critical moment came when the phalanxes collided. This was the othosmos, the push, and it decided nearly every hoplite battle in archaic and classical Greece. The front ranks met with a crash of bronze on bronze, spears thrusting into the press of bodies, men grunting and shoving and trying not to fall. The ranks behind leaned into the backs of the men in front, adding mass to the scrum. It was not elegant. It was not swift. It was a grinding, suffocating shoving match, where footing and cohesion mattered more than courage. If one side's formation stayed tight, if their shields locked and their ranks did not waver, the enemy line began to bow, then crack, then dissolve. Once men started to run, the killing began in earnest. But Spartans, famously, did not pursue. They held the field, stripped enemy dead of armor, and set up a trophy. The battle was won when the enemy admitted defeat and asked for their dead. Anything else was indiscipline. Spartans earned their reputation not by being faster or fiercer, but by being unshakable. They did not rout. They did not panic. At Thermopylae, when Xerxes sent wave after wave of Persian infantry into the narrow pass, the Spartans and their allies held formation, rotated tired men out of the front rank, and killed every soldier foolish enough to close with them. At Plataea the following year, when the Persian cavalry tried to break Greek cohesion with arrow volleys and feigned charges, the Spartan phalanx stood motionless until the order came to advance. Then they marched forward, shields locked, and crushed the Persian infantry in minutes. The rest of Greece noticed. But the phalanx was not an abstract formation. It was made of men who had names, who feared death, and who understood that their survival depended entirely on the man beside them. The phalanx functioned because every man in it believed something more powerful than tactics or training, that death in battle was preferable to the shame of survival through cowardice. This was not a poetic flourish. It was a psychological architecture built into Spartan society from childhood, reinforced daily in the mess halls, and enacted in public rituals that made clear what happened to men who failed the test. Fear existed, obviously. Spartans were not immune to the animal terror that grips anyone standing in bronze armor while 800 enemy spears advance, but they had spent 30 years learning that the consequences of running were worse than the consequences of dying. The Spartans called the ideal end kalos, thanatos, the beautiful death. Beauty in this context meant dying in formation, in defense of Sparta, with wounds to the front of the body. It was beautiful because it affirmed that the man had held his position, that he had not turned his back, that he had valued the survival of his comrades and the integrity of the phalanx above his own life. Spartans did not glorify death for its own sake. They glorified the specific death that preserved the line. A warrior who fell protecting the man beside him had fulfilled the highest purpose his society recognized. His name would be remembered. His family would be honored. His grave alone among all Spartan graves would bear an inscription. The calculus was deliberate. Spartan law permitted grave markers only for men who died in battle and women who died in childbirth. Every other citizen, no matter how wealthy or accomplished, went into the earth anonymously. This was not about denying death. It was about defining which deaths mattered. The warrior received a headstone because his death had purchased something tangible, Time for the phalanx to hold, space for others to regroup, proof that the system worked. The gravity of this recognition was amplified by its rarity. In a society that produced thousands of burials over centuries, only a fraction bore names. To earn that marker, a man had to demonstrate in his final moments that he had internalized everything the agoge and the Syssitia had taught him. The alternative carried consequences so severe they functioned as a social death, worse than the physical one. A Spartiate, who fled battle or showed cowardice, became a trescent, a trembler. The term itself carried contempt. Trembling implied not just fear but the failure to master it, a collapse of the discipline that separated Spartans from other Greeks. A trescent lost his citizenship rights immediately. He could not hold office, could not speak in the assembly, could not participate in religious festivals. More devastating, he was expelled from his Syssitia. Without a mess, he could not fulfill the social and economic obligations that defined Spartiate identity. He became invisible in the one place he had lived his entire adult life. Public shaming reinforced the legal penalties. A trescent had to shave half his beard, a visible mark of disgrace in a culture where adult male appearance signified status and self-control. He wore a cloak patched with different-colored fabrics, another deliberate violation of Spartan uniformity. Other citizens were not merely permitted but expected to strike him in the streets. No one defended him. No one spoke for him. The Syssitia that had shared meals with him for decades would not acknowledge his existence. Marriage became nearly impossible. No family wanted the stain. The trembler lived on in Sparta, technically free but functionally erased, a walking lesson in the cost of failure. The severity of this system did not reflect cruelty for its own sake. It reflected the mathematical reality of hoplite combat. If one man in the phalanx broke and ran, he created a gap. The enemy would exploit that gap instantly, collapsing the formation from within. The death of that one coward might lead to the death of dozens, then hundreds, as the line disintegrated. Spartans understood this. They had drilled it into their bodies. The man beside you was not an abstraction. He was the person whose shield protected your exposed right side, whose presence in the line meant you could focus forward instead of worrying about encirclement. His courage was your survival. Your courage was his. The trembler betrayed not an idea, but the flesh and blood men who had trusted him. Spartan mothers became legendary for their role in this psychological architecture, though the anecdotes that survived were likely as much prescription as description. The most famous command attributed to Spartan women was delivered to sons departing for war: return with your shield or on it. The phrase encoded the logic perfectly. A hoplite who fled discarded his heavy aspers to run faster. Returning without the shield meant returning as a coward. Returning on the shield meant returning dead, carried home by comrades who had not fled. The mother who spoke this line was not expressing bloodlust. She was reminding her son that his survival mattered less than his honor, and that his honor was inseparable from the survival of the men fighting beside him. Another story, preserved by Plutarch, described a Spartan mother whose son returned alive from a battle Sparta had lost. She killed him on the spot. Whether this happened or was simply a story Spartans told themselves is unknowable, but its circulation reveals something true about the values the society wanted to project. The message was clear: a mother would rather lose her son in honorable death than endure his survival through shameful flight. These stories were didactic instruments. They set an impossible standard, one that even Spartans likely failed to meet consistently, but the standard itself shaped behavior. A young warrior heading into his first battle carried not just the expectation of his comrades, but the imagined voice of his mother, his sisters, his wife, demanding that he not disgrace them. The Syssitia reinforced these expectations daily. Men who had fought together ate together, and the conversation in the mess naturally turned to battlefield conduct: who had held the line, who had advanced when ordered, who had wavered. These were not formal debriefings. They were the organic social surveillance of a community that knew shame was more effective than law. A warrior whose courage was questioned in the mess faced questions from men whose opinions mattered more than any magistrate's. Peter judgment was immediate, specific, and inescapable. The man who had to sit in silence while others recounted his failure understood that his social existence in Sparta had become conditional. The system worked because it aligned individual psychology with collective need in a way that made the selfish choice unbearable. A man standing in the phalanx, exhausted and terrified, might naturally want to run, but running meant losing his citizenship, his mess, his family's honor, and his own claim to identity in the only society he knew. Staying in line and dying meant his name on a stone, his family's pride, and the knowledge that his comrades would speak well of him. The calculus was cold but effective. Spartans did not need to be braver than other Greeks. They simply needed to be more afraid of shame than of death. This was the hinge on which the entire system turned. The agoge, the syssitia, the helot terror, the rituals, the songs, the dances, the mentorships, the beatings, all of it pointed toward this single moment, the moment when a man's nerve was tested in battle and he chose the line over his life. Sparta had built a machine to produce that choice as reliably as possible. It worked for centuries, and when it stopped working, when the population fell and the messes emptied and the phalanx thinned, the machine broke because it had no backup system. It had been designed for one purpose, and without enough men willing to die for it, the purpose became irrelevant. While men trained and fought, Spartan women occupied a unique position in the Greek world, managing estates and raising children in a society that took boys away and kept men at war. While men trained and fought, Spartan women occupied a unique position in the Greek world, managing estates and raising children in a society that took boys away and kept men at war. Their responsibilities extended far beyond the domestic seclusion common in Athens or Corinth. The Spartan woman controlled property, spoke freely in public, and trained her body with an intensity that scandalized visitors from other cities. She was expected to be strong, disciplined, and fiercely loyal to the state that relied on her labor and her sons. The system could not function without her, yet her life was shaped entirely by its demands. Spartan girls began physical training in childhood, long before marriage. They ran, wrestled, threw the javelin, and practiced discus in organized groups supervised by older women. The training took place outdoors, often in view of boys undergoing their own exercises, and the girls wore short tunics that left their legs bare. To Athenians, accustomed to keeping women indoors and veiled, this was shocking. Spartan women were called phainomarides, which meant thigh showers, a term that carried both mockery and unease. The Spartans themselves saw nothing improper in it. Strong mothers produced strong sons. A woman who could run and wrestle was more likely to survive childbirth and raise healthy children. The logic was functional, not liberating. Every aspect of female training served the state's need for soldiers. The exercises were demanding. Girls competed in foot races during public festivals, including the Heraean Games held in honor of Hera. They danced in religious processions, performed in choruses, and participated in mock combat drills that taught coordination and endurance. Plutarch remarked that Spartan women were trained so that their bodies would be hardy and their offspring vigorous. There was no notion that physical frailty enhanced femininity or modesty. A Spartan girl grew up understanding that her value lay in her capacity to bear and raise warriors. Her strength was not for her own sake, but for the survival of the polis. Marriage came relatively late, usually in the late teens or early 20s, later than in most Greek cities. The delay was intentional. Spartans believed that older brides were more likely to produce robust children and survive the ordeal of childbirth. The wedding ceremony itself was strange by Greek standards. The bride's hair was cut short, and she was dressed in a man's cloak and sandals. She waited alone in a darkened room. The groom, who might be 30 or older and still living in the barracks, visited briefly under cover of night. The encounter was furtive, almost covert, and the groom returned to his mess before dawn. This arrangement could continue for years. Some couples had children before they ever saw each other in daylight. The purpose of marriage was procreation, not companionship. Love, if it existed, was incidental. Once married, a Spartan woman assumed control of her household, and the kleros, the land allotment worked by helots that sustained her family. Her husband remained in the barracks, dining with his messmates and training with his unit. She managed the estate, oversaw helot labor, collected produce, and ensured that her husband's monthly contributions to the syssitia were delivered. This gave Spartan women substantial economic power. By the 4th century before the Common Era, women controlled a significant portion of Spartan land, inheriting property from fathers and brothers who died in battle. Some became quite wealthy. The concentration of land in female hands would later contribute to the demographic crisis, as fewer men could afford the contributions required to remain full citizens. Spartan women were expected to be literate and numerate, capable of managing accounts and overseeing complex agricultural production. They participated in religious festivals, made offerings at temples, and held certain priesthoods. They moved through public spaces without male escorts, spoke openly to men outside their families, and expressed opinions on politics and war. Plutarch recorded several sharp remarks attributed to Spartan mothers, including the famous line delivered to a son departing for battle, "Return with your shield, or on it." Another mother told that all 5 of her sons had died in battle, reportedly asked only whether Sparta had won. When assured of victory, she said she was content. These stories, whether literally true or not, captured the expectation. A Spartan woman did not weep or mourn. She bore loss with the same iron discipline demanded of men. Other Greeks found this disturbing. Aristotle criticized Sparta for giving women too much freedom and blamed their influence for the city's decline. He believed that women's control of property disrupted the balance of power, that their boldness undermined male authority. Athenian playwrights mocked Spartan women as loud, immodest, and unwomanly, yet the mockery often carried a note of fascination. Spartan women were physically striking, confident, and unapologetic. They were not trying to be men, but they occupied a space that other Greek societies reserved exclusively for males. Their freedom, such as it was, came not from enlightened egalitarianism, but from necessity. The men were always at war or preparing for it, and someone had to manage the land and raise the children. The role of mother was paramount, but it was not sentimental. A Spartan woman raised her children until the age of 7, then surrendered her sons to the state. She saw them occasionally after that, but their primary loyalty was to their mess group and their unit. Daughters remained longer, training until marriage, but the relationship was not one of tenderness. Mothers taught endurance, obedience, and pride in serving Sparta. Weakness or cowardice brought shame on the entire family. If a son faltered in battle or returned alive while his comrades died, his mother might refuse to see him. The stories are harsh and perhaps exaggerated, but they reflect the values Spartan society demanded. A woman's worth was measured by the courage of her sons and the strength of her body in producing them. Spartan women did not choose this life. They were born into a system that defined their purpose before they could speak. Yet within that system they exercised more autonomy than most Greek women ever knew. They owned land, managed estates, trained their bodies, and spoke their minds. They were not secluded or silent, but they were also not free. Every privilege they enjoyed existed because the state needed them to produce warriors and manage resources while men lived in barracks. Their strength served the same machinery that took their sons and sent their husbands to die. They were essential to Sparta's survival, yet their essentiality was entirely instrumental. The system valued them not as individuals but as mechanisms of reproduction and continuity. For all its internal cohesion, the Spartan system rested on contradictions it could not resolve. Equality among citizens depended on subjugation of helots. Military excellence required bodies the population could not sustain. The system that transformed boys into warriors and warriors into legend worked brilliantly until it began to consume itself. Sparta's strength had always rested on a narrow foundation, a small population of full citizens supported by helot labor, bound together by communal discipline and land allotments sufficient to sustain membership in the syssitia. When any part of that foundation cracked, the whole structure became fragile. By the 5th century before the Common Era, cracks had already appeared. Spartiate numbers had never been large. Herodotus reported roughly 8,000 Spartiate warriors at the height of Spartan power in the early 5th century, a figure that represented the entire adult male citizen body capable of bearing arms. But that number began falling steadily decade by decade, for reasons both structural and accidental. War took its share, particularly the kind of pitched hoplite battles Sparta specialized in. Unlike Athens, which could absorb losses by expanding citizenship or relying on naval power that required fewer hoplites, Sparta had no such flexibility. Every Spartiate who died at Thermopylae or Plataea left a hole that could not be filled. Citizenship was inherited, not granted, and the criteria were unforgiving. A man had to contribute his share to a syssitia, which required income from a kleros, which required helot labor and land. If he failed to meet that obligation, he lost citizen status entirely. He became one of the hypomeones, the inferiors, men of Spartiate birth, who could no longer afford full participation in the system. Land concentration made the problem worse. Spartan inheritance laws allowed property to pass to daughters as well as sons, an unusual practice in the Greek world that gave women considerable economic power. But it also meant that over generations land gradually accumulated in fewer hands. Wealthy families acquired more kleros plots, poorer families lost theirs. A Spartiate who inherited too little land could not produce enough to meet his mess contributions. He dropped out. His sons, even if they completed the agoge, could not become full citizens without the economic base to support membership. The system had been designed to create equality among peers, but it contained no mechanism to prevent inequality from creeping in through inheritance, marriage, and time. By the mid-5th century, the number of Spartiates able to fulfill their obligations had declined noticeably. Aristotle, writing later, noted the problem directly. Sparta suffered from oliganthropia, a shortage of men. The city could not field the armies it once had. And then, in the summer of 464 before the Common Era, the earth moved. The earthquake struck Laconia with devastating force. Thucydides recorded it briefly. Plutarch provided more detail, describing buildings collapsing in Sparta, young men crushed in the gymnasium, widespread destruction across the valley. Modern estimates suggest the quake reached significant magnitude, enough to topple stone structures and trigger landslides in the surrounding hills. The death toll among Spartiates was severe, perhaps 2,000 men, a catastrophic loss for a population already shrinking. But the earthquake itself was only the beginning. The helots saw their opportunity. With Sparta reeling, disorganized and grieving, the Messenian helots rose in open revolt. They fortified Mount Ithome, the ancient stronghold in the heart of Messenia, and held it against Spartan attempts to retake it. The revolt spread. Helots who had spent generations working Spartiate land, who outnumbered their masters 7-1, who had been terrorized by the Crypteia and kept in subjugation by constant surveillance, now fought back. The uprising lasted years. Sparta called on its Peloponnesian allies for help. Athens sent a force under Cimon, though the Spartans, suspicious and proud, sent the Athenians home before the siege concluded. Eventually Sparta negotiated terms. The helots on Mount Ithome were allowed to leave under truce. Many resettled in Naupactus, where Athens granted them refuge. But the damage had been done. The revolt exposed what Spartans had always feared. Their power rested on the continued submission of a population that hated them. Every kleros depended on helot labor. Every Spartiate's ability to spend his days training rather than farming depended on helots working the land. Every meal in the syssitia depended on helots delivering barley, wine, and oil. If the helots refused, if they revolted in sufficient numbers, the entire system collapsed. And now they had revolted. Sparta survived, but the knowledge that it could happen again hung over every subsequent generation. Economically, the revolt strained resources further. Spartiates who lost helot workers struggled to meet their mess contributions. Some fell into the ranks of the hypomeones. Fewer full citizens meant fewer hoplites. Fewer hoplites meant a weaker phalanx. Sparta had built its reputation on the ability to field disciplined, unbreakable infantry. But by the early 4th century before the Common Era, it could no longer field armies of the size and quality it once had. The agoge continued. Boys still slept on reed mats and stole food and endured beatings at the altar of Artemis Orthia. But the system was producing fewer warriors, and the warriors it produced were defending a state that had begun to hollow out from within. The crisis came to a head in the summer of 371 before the Common Era on a plain near the Boeotian city of Leuctra. Sparta had dominated Greek warfare for 2 centuries. Its hoplites had a reputation for invincibility in pitched battle, but Thebes, under the command of Epaminondas, had developed new tactics. Instead of the traditional phalanx 8 men deep, Epaminondas massed his left wing 50 men deep, creating an enormous column of force aimed directly at the Spartan right, where the king and the elite Spartiate troops traditionally stood. The Theban Sacred Band, an elite unit of paired lovers trained in a manner reminiscent of Spartan agoge discipline, led the attack. The Spartan phalanx, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, broke. King Cleombrotus fell in the fighting. So did 400 Spartiates, nearly a third of the entire citizen body present. For a population already reduced by decades of decline, the loss was catastrophic. Sparta had lost battles before, but never like this. Never a decisive defeat on land. In hoplite combat, the very mode of warfare Spartans had perfected. The myth of invincibility shattered at Leuctra. Thebes followed up its victory by invading the Peloponnese. In 370 before the Common Era, Epaminondas liberated Messenia. He refounded the ancient city of Messene, fortified it with massive walls that still stand today, and invited the Messenian helots to reclaim their independence. Sparta lost half its territory. More importantly, it lost the helot labor that had sustained the Kelleros system. Without Messenian helots working the land, Spartiates could not produce the surplus needed for Syssitia contributions. The economic base that made the agoge possible collapsed. Sparta survived as a city. It never fell to conquest, but after Leuctra and the loss of Messenia, it ceased to matter in Greek affairs. The population of full citizens continued to decline. By the late 4th century, there were fewer than 1,000 Spartiates. The Syssitia still met, but with fewer members and less food. The agoge still trained boys, but it trained them for a society that no longer existed. Spartan soldiers still fought, but as mercenaries in foreign armies, not as defenders of a powerful state. The contradictions inherent in the system had finally caught up with it. A society that claimed to value equality among citizens had created economic mechanisms that guaranteed inequality. A state that depended on subjugating helots had built no safeguards against their rebellion. A military culture that prized discipline and cohesion had no answer for enemies who innovated tactically. And a population that sent boys into brutal training and men into constant warfare could not replace the citizens it lost. By the Hellenistic period, Sparta survived not as a military power, but as a museum of its own past, performing rituals for tourists who wanted to glimpse the warriors of legend. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, Sparta no longer frightened anyone. The helots were gone, the phalanx, a memory, the Syssitia empty, or maintained as theatre. What remained was a town in the Peloponnese that had learned to monetize its own legend. Wealthy Romans travelled to Laconia not to negotiate treaties or fear invasion, but to watch young Spartan men whipped bloody at the altar of Artemis Orthia, a ritual that had once been a test of endurance and had now become a tourist attraction. The boys bled for an audience. Guides explained the history. Souvenirs were sold. Sparta had become a museum of itself, and the myth it produced would outlive the reality by millennia. The transformation began long before the Romans arrived. Even in the classical period, when Sparta still fielded armies, outside observers struggled to separate fact from propaganda. The Spartans themselves were famously reticent, offering little explanation of their customs and expelling foreign visitors who lingered too long. What the Greek world knew of Sparta came largely from admirers like Xenophon, who had spent time there and saw in its institutions a rebuke to Athenian decadence, or from Athenian writers who viewed Sparta with a mixture of respect and unease. Plato imagined his ideal city along vaguely Spartan lines: communal meals, state control of education, a warrior class devoted to the common good. He omitted the helots. Plutarch, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, produced the most influential account of Spartan life, crediting nearly every institution to a single lawgiver named Lycurgus. Lycurgus had travelled to Crete and Egypt, consulted the oracle at Delphi, and returned to impose a constitution so perfect that it endured unchanged for centuries. He banned coinage, distributed land equally, and instituted the agoge to ensure that no Spartiate grew soft. Then, having made the citizens swear never to alter his laws until he returned, Lycurgus left Sparta and starved himself to death in voluntary exile, ensuring his reforms would last forever. The story was inspiring, morally tidy, and almost certainly false. No contemporary source mentions Lycurgus. The institutions attributed to him developed gradually over centuries, shaped by war, earthquake, and the endless problem of controlling the helots. But Plutarch was not writing history as modern readers understand it. He was writing moral philosophy, illustrated with examples, and Sparta provided the best examples available: courage, discipline, contempt for luxury, subordination of self to state. The Roman fascination with Sparta was intensely selective. Romans admired Spartan military valor and the austere simplicity they imagined in Laconian life, but they showed little interest in the mechanisms that had sustained it. The Syssitia were praised as models of egalitarian fellowship, with no mention of the helot labor that filled the plates. The agoge became a symbol of toughness and self-denial, scrubbed of the hunger, the beatings, and the cryptia. Roman moralists invoked Spartan mothers who told their sons to return with their shields or on them, holding up this stoicism as superior to the softness of Roman matrons. They did not dwell on a society that took children from their families at 7 and never gave them back. The whipping rituals at Artemis Orthia epitomized this selective memory. In the classical period, the ceremony had been one element of a brutal education system, a test of endurance before peers and elders. By the Roman era, it had become the main event, performed in an amphitheatre built specifically to accommodate spectators. Ancient writers mention Romans watching boys compete to see who could endure the most lashes without crying out, blood pooling on stone, the crowd applauding. The ritual no longer served any military or educational purpose. It was heritage performance, a living monument to a past that Romans wanted to believe had existed exactly as Plutarch described it. Some boys died under the whip. The Spartans kept whipping. This version of Sparta, frozen and mythologized, proved more durable than the historical city ever had been. Medieval and Renaissance Europeans knew almost nothing of genuine Spartan institutions, but they knew the legend warriors who preferred death to dishonor, a city without walls because its men were its walls, mothers who sacrificed sons without tears. The details were vague and often wrong, but the outline was appealing to anyone who wanted to believe that discipline and sacrifice could produce invincible strength. When nation-states began conscripting mass armies, Sparta provided a vocabulary. When fascist movements sought historical precedents for totalitarian conformity, they pointed to Lycurgus. The Nazis were particularly fond of Sparta, holding it up as a model of racial purity and martial excellence, conveniently ignoring that Spartans had been Greeks living centuries before the concept of race as modernity understood it existed, and that their system had collapsed from within. Modern invocations of Sparta continue this tradition of selective memory. Military units adopt Spartan symbols: the lambda shield, the red cloak, the laconic phrase. Fitness culture embraces the agoge as metaphor, selling obstacle course races and high-intensity training programs under names that evoke ancient warriors, though the participants go home to their families at night and eat as much as they like. The Spartan warrior has become shorthand for mental toughness, self-discipline, and the refusal to quit, stripped of the coercion, the child abuse, and the society built on slavery that made the historical version possible. The movie that depicted the Battle of Thermopylae as a clash between freedom and tyranny somehow forgot that Spartans lived in barracks under constant surveillance and that their economy ran on the forced labor of an entire subjugated population. What makes the myth so durable is that it contains a kernel of something real. Spartans did stand at Thermopylae. They did maintain a ferocious infantry for several centuries. They did produce men who would rather die than break formation. But the cost of that excellence was higher than the myth admits. Spartan boys grew up hungry, beaten, and afraid, deprived of family and educated into a narrow creed that valued obedience over thought. Spartan men lived regimented lives, eating the same meals, singing the same songs, reduced to interchangeable parts in a military machine. Spartan women bore children for the state, knowing their sons would be taken and might die in wars fought to keep helots subjugated. And the helots, who outnumbered citizens and made the entire system possible, lived under terror, hunted in the night by boys proving their readiness to kill. The primary sources for Spartan history are maddeningly partial. Spartans themselves wrote almost nothing down, or what they wrote did not survive. Later Greeks wrote about Sparta from the outside, often with agendas. Plutarch romanticized, Xenophon admired, Thucydides observed with cooler eyes but still saw Sparta through the lens of its rivalry with Athens. Archaeology offers fragments, ruins of villages that never became a grand city, a simple stone sanctuary to Artemis, remnants of the amphitheater where tourists watch the whippings. Inscriptions are rare, the material culture is sparse. What remains is a historical outline, rough enough that each generation can project onto it what it wants to see. The myth endures because it answers a perennial human question. What would we be capable of if we eliminated distraction, indulgence, and the usual comforts of civilian life? Sparta offers an answer, or seems to. The problem is that the answer is incomplete. Yes, extreme discipline and sacrifice can produce formidable soldiers. They can also produce a society so rigid that it cannot adapt, so dependent on subjugation that it collapses when the foundation cracks, so obsessed with military excellence that it sacrifices everything else human beings need to flourish. Sparta trained its sons to stand in formation and die without flinching, and for a few centuries that was enough to make other Greeks tremble. But systems built entirely on coercion and sacrifice do not endure, and the warriors who seemed invincible at Thermopylae left behind only ruins, stories, and the uncomfortable question of what we are willing to destroy in the name of strength.